And that's where if you get too far down this rabbit hole, it's like everything becomes symbolic.
Yeah.
And you're like, you just...
Did it happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, like, everything becomes symbolic, everything becomes a metaphor, everything becomes an object lesson, and you're like, or some of these things historically happened, and then the application can arise out of the actual event that happened. And again, if you think in terms of which accounts did Moses put down on purpose, so God is giving this stuff to Moses, Moses is writing it down, which stories of Israel's history are going to be most important? And you're like, all right, the fall, that introduces how sin got into the world, corrupted man, all right, and the punishment that comes when you corrupt yourself. Okay, that seems really applicable to Israel. Right after the flood, what do you get? The dispersion of the languages and the choosing of Israel out of the nations. So it lets them know, you are God's chosen people. So out of this wicked bunch of people who came from a godly line, because Noah was godly, but there's all these wicked people who came out, and we see this pattern happen again and again and again. So Adam is a godly man. One of his children is bad. Seth is a godly man. His children are bad. Noah is a godly man. His children are bad. It's a pattern that repeats. And so even Abram, and you look at some of his children, and you really rapidly see it like, ooh, not good. You can see the lesson that Israel is supposed to learn, and that's why God is going to keep telling them, fathers, you need to teach your children, and you need to teach your children to teach their children so that this doesn't keep happening. You know, and so you can see some of these patterns, and as you look and say, why is this story here? It becomes fairly obvious. This is trying to teach the lesson of this is what God does when you're wicked. And learn the lesson so you don't repeat the mistake and get punished again. And you'll see that playing out. But I think that's a really good observation, though, is this idea of if it wasn't global, why do you have such a big ark? Why do you have animals? Why do you have so much water? Like, why? Well, again, unless you symbolize everything, you just go where the text leads you. All right, some other things here. God promised there would never be a flood of that scale again. So when they come out of the ark, he puts the rainbow. Again, remembering that before this point, there wasn't rain like that. Okay, so if we go from all the way back to the Garden of Eden, there was that mist that came up off the ground and all that. So the idea of rain seems to not be something that would happen. As you get water vapor and those crystals and stuff in the air, it's going to create rainbows. So when God puts a rainbow up in the sky, it's, well, now we have that water vapor in the sky like we didn't before. Okay, it's not saying they never ever saw a rainbow. That's the refraction of light. It happens. But they probably didn't see the big old sky-encompassing rainbows that you see. And symbolically, it's God putting his war bow up, so to speak, to say, I won't do that again. You know, it's kind of a mental image that you get where it's like there's a bow in the sky, and it's almost like you're saying, I'm not going to do that to you again. You know, just kind of a word play. But again, if God says, I will never flood the earth again, but it was a local flood, local floods happen all the time. So that God is a liar then, or he meant it symbolically? I don't know. As the Bible says, all the high hills are covered. And like I said, since water seeks its own level, the flood would have rapidly spilled out into the localized area. So it wouldn't have stayed local. So anyway, just some things to think about as we look at the global flood idea there. Any other questions or comments on that? Like I said, there are texts in the scripture that will use the word all outside of the whole world context. So, 2 Samuel 18, it talks about the battle spreading over the whole earth. We understand. In the culture of Israel, it's the whole face of the earth. Like if I were standing on the mountain looking out across, there's this huge battle. So you just pay attention to wording. Don't do your Strong's Concordance search. Every time you find the word all, you assume it means the whole world. Use some context clues here. First Chronicles 14:17 speaks to the guy and says his fame spread over all the earth. There probably were people who didn't know his name, but the entire area where his name could spread, he was popular. He was like Justin Bieber. Anyway, so it doesn't always mean exactly what it's saying. It means what the context implies that it's saying. Okay? That makes sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So again, we can trust our Bible, but you have to read the Bible in its own context. Okay? That's the key here. You can't just run, and that is the danger of the Strong's Concordance method to Bible study, because there are words that one author will use very specifically and another author will use very generally. Because Jeremiah is not going to write the same way that David does. Even though they're both inspired by God, even though they're both preserved, God is going to use their personality. So just to put it in perspective, imagine that John wrote a book and I wrote a book. We would probably have some very different things to say. And if we were both inspired by God, he would use our respective personalities, our respective experiences. And so certain words that John would use in a very specific way, I might not use like that. So that's why you've got to be very careful as you study the Bible to say, what is the context telling me? Okay, I can make an assumption. So that's why I explain the word all to say it does not always mean all in our understanding of the word all. But in the case of the flood, I do believe it means the whole world because of context. Okay? Again, you have to take the original context into meaning. Okay? Like, in case you missed it. Okay, this is all on page 11. Grammatically, the language is global. The amount of time it takes for the waters to recede is global. The ark is massive, so therefore, it seems to be more than local. The whole world was wicked, so the flood would have to be global. The traditions from around the world that deal with a worldwide flood are all over the place. They don't all agree, obviously. I really love it when atheists bring that up. So creationists will say, there are worldwide flood stories all over the place. And so you got atheists like Aron Ra who will come out and be like, yeah, but they don't all agree. That's not the point. The point is not that they all agree. It's when you have 100 some odd stories from around the world and they all tell the exact same story, it kind of implies that there might be something true to that. So let's even go mythology-wise. Remember we talked about creation. God created the earth out of what? Nothing. But once he created the earth, what did the earth start as? But what did the earth start as?
Nothing.
Nothing, but once he created the earth, what was the earth?
Formless.
A formless ball of water. What do you say almost all mythologies talking about the earth? How does the earth start? Water. Is that a coincidence?
Fluid.
You know? So either all floods, all stories everywhere came from a common, background, or the idea that water is the source of all life. Evolution's true. Anyway, but I find it fun when you study mythology. You can start seeing little hints of truth buried in those mythological stories, because again, it's the telephone game. The story gets passed down enough times, gets embellished, gets tailored to the culture that it came into. But you can kind of trace it back and find roots and go, oh, okay, these stories may all be different, but they all have these roots in common. So maybe there's a truth there. Okay, you got to be careful with it, obviously. But I think when you see a flood story showing up in almost every culture around the world, probably was some sort of devastating flood that left an imprint on everybody's consciousness. Maybe. Okay. Number 6, contrary to the supposed evidence, there's actually many strong evidences for a worldwide flood. We've covered a few of those already with some of the rock layers laid down at Mount St. Helens and some of those things. And God promised there would never be a flood on that scale again. So therefore, if he did allow local floods, he would be a liar. All right. All the high hills were covered. Since water seeks its own level, the flood would have rapidly spilled out into the localized area. Okay, so those are just some things to take into account. Now, here's some size stuff with the ark. So I do want you to jot down some of these notes. I think this will be helpful for you. Depending on your definition of a cubit. Now remember, a cubit is 18 inches long. It's the distance between your elbow, like the point of your elbow and your middle finger. That was a cubit. They would have cubits based on, the king at the time, but the royal cubit traditionally was about 18 inches. So if you have people who are bigger than we are, then obviously all of these dimensions get scaled up in size. If you have people who are a little bit smaller than we are, all of these dimensions get scaled down a little bit. These dimensions are figured out with about an 18-inch long cubit. Okay, so check out these statistics. The ark was at least 75 feet by 45 feet by 450 feet. Okay, so the ark is basically like a long box. Okay, so it's 450 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet. Okay, so it's really, like, I mean, if you want to picture it, you're putting like a bunch of shoe boxes end to end, and you're kind of getting a picture of what the ark looks like. Okay, I used to have a model of it. It's in my shed right now. I left it in my Sunday school classroom, told them don't touch it, and they proceeded to smush it. So it's like, really, guys? So my ark model is completely ruined. This is the equivalent of 522 railroad cars in volume.
I've been in West Virginia, and I know what that's.
So you know what a railroad car is. So you can get a picture of how big it is. All right? So 522 railroad cars. Imagine what you could fit in them. That's a lot. Okay? Now, some of this still brings up difficulties, so we'll address it. Since one railroad car can hold about 240 sheep, we could hold 100,000 sheep-sized animals in this. Now, that is an exaggeration. Let me tell you why. Okay? If I am stacking railroad cars like this, okay, and then I stack them this way, stack them this way, stack them this way, stack them this way, okay? So if this is like a cross-section of my ark, all right, most of this space is probably going to be empty because you're not actually going to literally have all the walls and the metal structures, okay? You get what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So even if you divide this in half, so you got 50,000 animals, something like that. You know, not all the animals are going to be sheep-sized. In fact, most of them aren't going to be even that size when you start thinking about the size of a dog and a cat and other things. Now, you could very easily have some sort of pen system. So you could have a system that kind of looks like this. Probably have some sort of layout along the bottom to have some sort of structural integrity. You know, you're not going to be right up against the beams. But again, you're going to have probably plenty of room when all is said and done. Answers in Genesis has done a bit of work in trying to figure out how some of this would work. They believe that you would have had the cap to the ark, and this would have actually used pressure systems like the movement of the water and all that to kind of pump fresh air in and vent stale air out. So it supposedly would have kept the air moving. We just don't know. The Bible doesn't lay it out for us. We don't know what gopher wood is specifically. All we know is a certain type of wood he was asked to use. He tarred it up with pitch. He sealed it. But we don't know all of the details. But again, as far as the space on the ark, there's plenty, okay? That whole idea of the bathtub ark is pretty ridiculous. Obviously, the animals were not in the little, like, children's boat with, like, the giraffe heads poking out the sides.
Sure.
Pretty sure. All right. Again, what about the water? I like this quote by Jacques Cousteau. I remember years ago when I was discussing this with an evolutionist, he made two pictures for me. He had a picture like this, and he said, you know, this is the Earth. And then he drew a bigger ball, and he says, this is the amount of water that you would need. And I was like, how do you figure that? And so he had it all mapped out, and I said, what do you mean? Like, where do you get those values? And what he did is he took Mount Everest, and he said, if you take Mount Everest, you add 20 feet to the top of Mount Everest, you cover the whole Earth with enough water to cover Mount Everest, you wouldn't have enough water to cover the whole Earth. That's why I started off with an explanation of the whole plate tectonics thing. Because if the Marianas Trench, which I think is 7 miles deep.
It's like 40,000 feet deep or something.
Okay. It's basically you can fit all of Mount Everest in the Marianas Trench and still have plenty of room to spare. Yeah. So you take Marianas Trench, you seal that up a little bit, your water levels are going to rise substantially. You then push the mountains down a little bit, you don't need nearly as much water. In fact, Jacques Cousteau is credited with saying this, were the crust of the earth to be leveled with great mountain ranges like the Himalaya and ocean abysses like the Mariana Trench evened out, no land at all would show above the surface of the sea. Earth would be covered by a uniform sheet of water more than 10,000 feet deep. So overwhelming the oceans seem to be. Now, this could very well be like a back of an envelope calculation. It's not saying this is precise, but here's a guy who did a lot of work in the oceans, and he's just making this comment. Listen, there's plenty of room in the ocean to bury a lot of water.
Well, I'm saying if everything was level.
If everything was level. So you take the whole Earth, you smooth it out so it's a nice level ball. There's no surface. Okay? And you see, if you pay attention to the creation account, what do you see God doing? There is a ball of water, and he gathers the land together, and what do you see popping above the surface of the earth is the dry ground, which he calls earth. So the creation account is even going to imply that God basically did this, where the earth is somewhere underneath the water, and God is gathering the dirt together, and you've got the, if you want to think about it, like an underwater mountain range, and the peak of the mountain pops up above the surface. So it's not too extreme to think, especially when you start imagining other sources of water. So if you have water trapped under caves or other things like that, water could come from other sources and fill up. And then as those plates start moving again, it could create those deep trenches. It's going to create the mountain ranges. And so that's where the water pools back off the earth. And so that's what we could be seeing as a result of the flood. So the flood could really be this devastating, plates are starting to move, everything gets covered. And then when the plates hit each other while the flood's going on, more landmass starts arising, the trenches open up, the water drains back down into those areas, and it takes so long to drain off. Okay, that makes sense. Like, okay, so that's where the water came from. So that's why I think this drawing is unrealistic, because Mount Everest wouldn't have been as tall back then. And again, the Bible uses language like all the high hills. So there's language used to kind of imply the mountains weren't as big. So anyway, that's where we get some of that stuff. Any questions?